Hello and welcome back. We are going to cover some of the main points in Chapter 7, which takes us through the process of photosynthesis. Keep in mind that Chapter 6 and 7, so cellular respiration in Chapter 6 and now photosynthesis in Chapter 7, are part of the energy transformation unit. And we can synthesize how carbon essentially moves through living systems. So as we go through photosynthesis, try to keep track of carbon molecules, and then it will make more sense about how that carbon is processed during cellular respiration. Before we get into the actual process of photosynthesis, it's important to know something about the nature of sunlight, since sunlight is one of the major inputs of this process. The electromagnetic spectrum, as we can see here, is an array of wavelength frequencies. So everything from radio waves, which we can see in terms of frequency, they are much more spread out, and the length between wavelength crests is much more spread out than, let's say, a very high frequency wave like a X-ray or gamma ray. It just depends on the intensity of the wave. So when we're talking about sunlight in terms of intensity or electromagnetic spectrum, sunlight is somewhat right here in the middle, and we can see it is just below ultraviolet frequency and just above infrared. And interestingly enough, the term ultraviolet literally means right above violet. So we can see that violet color is the most intense visible light spectrum. So sunlight or visible light, both of these, exists in different colors. And if we can interpret this graph correctly, we see that colors are nothing more than different wavelengths. So we have the lowest intensity color, which is just a wavelength of this number range, and then everything up to the most intense color, which is just a very high intensity wavelength of 380. And remember, these numbers are decreasing as we increase in intensity, and that just means that the intensity refers to the length between these wavelength crests. So since sunlight is going to be an input to photosynthesis, we need to understand the nature of sunlight. And so sunlight we interpret as wavelengths. And photosynthesis actually will utilize everything from 510 to 380, and then 575 to 780. The actual pigment molecule responsible for harnessing sunlight does not absorb the wavelength in between 510 and 575, or also known as the color green. And interestingly enough, that is the only color not absorbed by our pigment molecule chlorophyll. And because it is not absorbed by that molecule, it is essentially refracted back out, and that is what our eyes detect, which is why most plants appear green to us, because essentially the pigment molecules in those plants are spitting out that green wavelength. It's not being absorbed, so our eyes pick that up and interpret that as the color green. So the big picture. Okay, so photosynthesis, again, if we were to break this word down, it's a Greek term literally meaning putting together using sunlight or light. And it's a process by which plants, some algae, and even some bacteria can literally transform the energy in the light into the chemical energy of glucose, which was a simple sugar that we looked at in chapter 3. Carbon dioxide and water are also utilized, and then we have our waste product, molecular oxygen. And if you recall chapter 6, cellular respiration, the outputs of photosynthesis that we see here are actually the inputs to cellular respiration. And then conversely, the inputs that we see here in photosynthesis were the outputs of cellular respiration. So as I mentioned last chapter, they are literally inverse processes of one another. All of the energy on Earth, essentially used to sustain life, ultimately comes from the sun in the form of sunlight energy. And living things, again, are able to harness the light energy from the sun and essentially turn it into the chemical energy of sugar. And then cellular respiration takes us through the process of transforming the chemical energy of sugar into the chemical energy of ATP. So again, just reiterating that these are energy transformations. So keep in mind the law of conservation of energy, one of the laws of thermodynamics. You can't create or destroy energy or matter, merely transform it. So again, we're just looking at how different modes of energy are being transformed by living things. Here's our chemical equation. So definitely be able to identify this on a multiple choice scenario. So our main inputs here for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight energy will yield sugar. So C6H12O6 is glucose and some molecular oxygen. And if you recall cellular respiration equation, if you essentially reverse the arrow and add in some ATP and eliminate the sunlight, that is the chemical equation for cellular respiration. So again, we really are seeing how these two processes mirror one another. There are two stages to photosynthesis that we will need to break down and understand in order to see how these energy transformations take place. So stage 1 is called the light reaction. The light reactions because this is where light comes into play. Embedded in the leaves of plants, and the leaves are the photosynthetic organs in a plant, are tiny organelles called the chloroplast. And we went over organelle function in chapter 4. So if you recall the chloroplast, its main function was photosynthesis. So we're going to zoom in on that. Within the inner membranes of the chloroplast, so there are just stacks and stacks of little membranes. Embedded in these membranes, so here we see a membrane and what's called these thylakoid stacks, are various protein chains. And again, this almost identical to cellular respiration, the electron transport chain at the end was also a series of proteins that was able to harness the energy in electrons and transform it. So we're essentially doing the same thing here. So embedded in these membranes within the chloroplasts are chlorophyll pigment molecules. And we can find those embedded in big complexes, so called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. We have essentially a bunch of these chlorophyll pigment molecules, and their job is to absorb incoming sunlight, and through a very complicated chemical reaction, electrons within those pigment molecules become excited. And of course, excited electrons yield potential energy that the cell can then harness to make stuff and do work. So as that excited electron from chlorophyll is passed from protein to protein, again, we're generating a proton gradient, and we are also making a little bit of ATP. So this is essentially the same exact process of cellular respiration. We're harnessing the energy in electrons to make our energy molecule ATP. But we only make a little bit of this molecule. It's not enough to sustain the plant. That's why they also do cellular respiration. But some energy is made. And at the same time, all right, we have also generated some electron carriers. So we've seen these before as well. They were called different things. They had different acronyms for the mitochondria, but same functions here. And we've then generated a proton gradient. At the same time, a molecule of water is split. And that is where our molecular oxygen is released as a waste product. So I've outlined for you the 5 main things that happen early on in the light reaction. So incoming light energy or solar energy is absorbed by the chlorophyll pigment in our photosystems. That energy triggers a water molecule to split, and all we need from that water is the electron. So that electron becomes energized, and the chlorophyll pigment molecule will essentially pass it along from protein to protein. In doing so, hydrogen ions or protons from the water will generate our proton gradient, which then goes on to phosphorylate a molecule of ADP into ATP. This is the exact same thing we saw last chapter. The electrons stripped from water are carried to the next stage on proton carriers, in this case NADPH. And the oxygen from water is released as waste. So again, very, very similar process to what we saw in cellular respiration. And stage 2 is called the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle. Called the dark reaction because it does not require sunlight. This process happens 24/7. You can also see it's called the Calvin cycle in some places because Calvin is the last name of the scientist who really figured out a lot of what was happening here. So the products that we just generated, so a little bit of ATP and some electrons on our electron carrier, get used up here. Our electron carrier drops off the electrons that were stripped from water, and essentially those electrons will affix themselves to some carbon dioxide from the air through a series of chemical reactions using some energy that we made earlier into a 3-carbon molecule called G3P. So again, the main idea here is that carbon dioxide that just floats into the leaf from tiny little pores, it's already present in the air, along with some electrons and some energy, will all be combined together to make a 3-carbon molecule called G3P. 2 molecules of G3P are joined together to make a 6-carbon molecule we know as glucose, which is the main output of photosynthesis. And if you recall from chapter 3, glucose is essentially the raw form of energy for the cell. So cells cannot directly utilize the energy stored in the glucose molecule. Cellular respiration transforms the chemical energy of glucose into the chemical energy of ATP, and ATP is what is directly used as energy. So two major things happening here in the dark reactions: carbon fixation, which is where carbon dioxide molecules from the environment are essentially fixed together. Reduction simply means adding electrons to a molecule. And then we have our precursor glucose molecule, which will go on to make what we really came here for, a simple sugar, and in this case it's going to be glucose. So here are the two reactions all together. The light-dependent reactions, again, we have some incoming sunlight. The energy of that sunlight will excite electrons in chlorophyll molecules that are embedded in these big photosystems. The energy being passed from these chlorophyll electrons will split a molecule of water, generating a proton gradient, releasing molecular oxygen as a byproduct or a waste product. And then eventually that electron gets picked up on a carrier. So two main things that are made in the first part. We have an electron carrier and some hydrogen ions. And as our hydrogen ions build up, as water molecules are split, those hydrogen ions will essentially fuel the work to make our molecule of ATP, which is then used in our second phase here. Along with the electrons that we have stripped to make essentially a molecule of sugar, or glucose in this case.